Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the psychotherapy series of lectures. In today's lesson, we're going to talk about behavioral theory and behavioral therapy. So many of you likely know about individuals like Pavlov and Skinner and Watson and so forth. What we're going to do today is take these principles and apply them to psychotherapy. And in fact, this is not new. There are, I want to say about 70 different behaviorally related therapies that are considered empirically supported. So we started with a scientific, theoretical lens, and then we shifted over to a more psychotherapeutic lens. And we'll talk about all of this as we go. So we're going to, as I said, talk about the theory and the practice of behavioral therapy. We're going to highlight, and it's very important to highlight what scientific behaviorism is. Scientific behaviorism suggests that psychology is or should be an objective natural science. So we are going to focus on directly observable behavior. And that's exactly what behavioral therapy does, is the focus or the target is behavior. We might want to increase the likelihood of a behavior. We might want to decrease the likelihood of a behavior. We might want to shift the focus of behavior or our perspective on a behavior. All of that's going to fall within the purview of behavioral therapy. Now, it's interesting. Michael Mahoney suggested that psychoanalysis and behaviorism are the yin and the yang of determinism. What does that mean? If we go back to our understanding of psychoanalysis, Freud believed in psychical determinism, which is more of a mentalistic determinism. That means that our drives impact our behavior in a clear way, and Freud believed that there was no free will, but it's more due to our drives and our unconscious. Well, behaviorism believes in the principle of environmental determinism. That is to say, the environmental stimuli influence our behavior in predictable ways, or the environment determines our outcome. And both believe that there's no free will or limited free will, depending on who is speaking for that school of thought. But it's interesting, they take the opposite perspective, but come to the same conclusion, suggesting that there is no free will. Now, in earlier lessons, we know that other models of treatment do believe that there is free will. So if you go into an existential model or a humanistic model or a Gestalt model, these models believe strongly in the responsibility of the person and the potential for growth. So they are going to oftentimes be referred to as third force factors. But now it's interesting to think about how these theories developed in a time period. So the first model was psychoanalytic thinking. And Watson suggests that psychoanalysis is wrong. And he writes two landmark papers, one in 1913 and one in 1918. Psychology as a Behaviorist Sees It, in which he suggests that psychoanalysis is analogous to the soul. Just like you cannot see or measure the existence of a soul, the same thing can be said about the unconscious. And because you cannot empirically measure the unconscious, Watson suggests that psychology's focus should be on the directly observable if it's going to be a psychological science. So that's Michael Mahoney, and that's kind of some of the backdrop. As we think about human change, there are 3 stages. One is behaviorism as a scientific endeavor. So that's where Skinner and Pavlov get their notoriety. There are other individuals such as Watson, Mary Cover Jones, Arnold Lazarus, and Volpe, who put more of a focus on behavioral therapy, right? So shifting from the scientific understanding of behaviorism and then applying it to behavioral therapy. And then with the cognitive revolution, there is a merging of the cognitive perspective with the behavioral, and acknowledgement that our thoughts, our motivations play a role in therapy. All right, so as I said, John Watson was a leading voice, and he wrote 2 papers. And in one in particular, he said psychology should focus on directly observable behavior as an objective branch of natural sciences. Now, behaviorists rejected this sense of consciousness and introspection. Now, consciousness and introspection were some of the earlier points of view of William James and Wilhelm Wundt. So he was also railing to some degree against that perspective. And he believed in determinism, and that was very strongly against the tide, where other people were suggesting that there is free will. He went against that. Today, I think that there's an understanding that there is free will. However, we do have tendencies, right? So if we're going to try and understand everything we learned, we talked about psychoanalytic approaches, we talked about Adlerian approaches and the sense of the self, we talked about humanistic and existential perspectives, and now we're talking about behavioral perspective. So where do we land today? We land somewhere in the middle. That is to say, we acknowledge there is free will, there is the potential for growth. However, we are impacted by tendencies, as I said, and that's important. I think it's important to think about history as you know, we were still figuring things out. So there tended to be lines drawn in the sand by certain theorists that were directly opposed to other theorists. And today we kind of see that there is a synthesis of thought. All right. So when we think of little Hans and little Albert, which were 2 different approaches. Little Hans was the example that Freud used to demonstrate castration anxiety, and little Albert was a child that Watson used to demonstrate the concepts of classical conditioning. Now, in little Albert experiment, he took an 11-month-old baby who was originally not afraid of a white rat. And through classical conditioning, he demonstrated that you could create a fear to something such as the white rat. So what did Watson do? Well, Watson had iron crowbars that he would bang together right before exposing little Albert to the white rat. And through this repeated association between a loud noise, which naturally elicits fear, and a white rat, he learned to pair these two together and develop a fear for the white rat. And that, this study is controversial. And there are many people who suggest that Watson would not have been able to do this study because it violates research ethics principles. But I want you to think about when Watson was doing his work. He was doing his work in the early 1920s and actually before that. But the little Albert study was done in the 1920s. And the first code of research ethics that comes out is in 1948 with the Nuremberg Code. So there are some studies that are questionable in nature that we may not be able to do. Now, it's interesting, people really criticize Watson for the little Albert study. And they say, oh, there was psychological damage. And some books say, and the fate of little Albert is unknown to this very day. And this is not true. We know that little Albert moved away with his family. Now, he did die early, but it had nothing to do with his study. He moved away, and the ethical question is, did Watson conditioning fear create a fear response in perpetuity? And I'm going to argue based on two reasons that I don't think that little Albert would have been afraid. The first argument is based on neurobiology. We know there's something called infantile amnesia, which is just a fancy way of saying that children typically don't remember things that happened before the age of 3, and little Albert was 11 months. We also know that exposure therapy results in, the strength of the association between the loud noise and the white rat is likely to become uncoupled. And that is more of a behavioral argument for extinction. And I'm going to talk to you about extinction as we move further along. But extinction is a process of a previously conditioned response being eliminated. And that does happen. And I want to ask you, is it possible for little Albert to avoid things that are either white, like the white rat, furry, like the texture of the white rat, or fuzzy? Probably not. So repeated exposure to white, furry, and fuzzy objects is likely to lessen the strength of association. And ultimately, I would argue that little Albert would not be afraid of the white rat or anything similar to it. Now, one of the things that is also unsaid about Watson's study is he wanted to demonstrate that just like you can condition fear, you can also decondition fear. And the issue was that little Albert left. So he never got to prove that point. However, one of Watson's students, Mary Cover Jones, was able to demonstrate the principle of counter conditioning. And counter conditioning is exactly that, the process of new associative learning and deconditioning fear. Now, she did a study with Peter, little Peter, who was afraid of rabbits, and she was able to, through counter conditioning, eventually remove Peter's fear of rabbits. So it's interesting, right? So we can use exposure techniques or associative learning, classical conditioning, to both condition fear or decondition fear, right? And what's important is that in counter conditioning, the approach is to associate whatever the conditioned stimulus was with positive emotional experiences. And eventually, whatever the condition response was, in the case of Peter, fear, would be unwritten into something which is called comfort. So ultimately, Mary Cover Jones did a very good job in deconditioning fear in Peter, and it was through a counter conditioning process. Now, the same counter conditioning principle is at work with Volpe's systematic desensitization, and I will talk to you about the systematic desensitization approach of exposure therapy, but that's what's going on with systematic desensitization. But the last point I'll make on this is, look, it was Mary Cover Jones and her work, not John Watson's work, that demonstrated how we can decondition or remediate fears and phobias. So, all right, let's shift towards the principle of behavioral therapy. Now, when we talk about behavioral therapy, we have to understand the time period, right? So we have 3 different research groups who are trying to introduce principles of behavioral therapy. So we have Skinner, who's talking about operant conditioning as a whole. We have Volpe, Lazarus, and Rahman in South Africa, who talk about systematic desensitization. And we have Hans Eynsink and the Maudsley group in the United Kingdom trying to apply a modern learning theory to understanding psychiatric problems. So there are, it's a perfect storm of ideas that can come together. And I don't think that these concepts are in opposition of one another. I actually think that they can work hand in hand. So let's start. And then obviously we have the cognitive behavioral modification, right? So we have to acknowledge that thoughts influence behaviors. We have to acknowledge that emotions influence behaviors, right? So behavioral therapy does continue to evolve in the 60s and 70s and whatnot, and an emphasis from Cyril Franks highlights this point, where he says, above all, in behavioral therapy, a theory is servant that is useful only until a better theory and better therapy comes along. So there is an acknowledgement that behavioral treatment or behavioral therapy is supposed to change. And with the cognitive revolution of the 60s, most behavioral therapists acknowledge that thoughts and emotions, expectations, motivation, all these factors impact behavioral outcomes. And today we have this concept of cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's interesting, right? The original Association for the Advancement of Behavioral Therapy actually renamed itself with emphasis to absorb cognitive approaches. So they now call themselves ABCT, which is the Association of Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, because thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are all intertwined. So the 2 major beliefs of behaviorists and behavioral therapy is that behavioral therapy is best if we apply learning theory, and behavioral therapy is best when we use techniques that are grounded in science, right? So Arnold Lazarus, he's one of those individuals that I mentioned earlier. He had a long career at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and one of his idea is that learning theory is not a singular concept, it's learning theories. The same way cognitive behavioral therapy should be cognitive behavioral therapies. It should all be in plural. All right, so let's talk about operant conditioning and applied behavioral analysis. So operant conditioning is the belief that a behavior is influenced by its consequences. Now, applied behavioral analysis capitalizes on this, and they refer to something called the ABCs: antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. So an antecedent in the behavioral ABCs reflects all the things that happen before the maladaptive behavior occurred. Now, notice at the onset, we are acknowledging that the behavior you do is maladaptive. But the antecedent is, well, what's the trigger? What's the environmental factors happening right before you did that behavior? The behavior is the maladaptive action you took. And then the consequence is what happened after the maladaptive behavior occurs. And to me, I think it's important to note that this belief in applied behavioral analysis and operant conditioning on a theoretical level is behaviors are governed by its consequences. So if a behavior results in a consequence that is desirable, it's likely to reinforce that outcome. If it results in a consequence that's aversive or undesirable, it's likely to decrease that behavior. And we'll talk about that. So this is based on basic principles of stimulus response theory, right? SR learning, which is part of operant conditioning. Now, applied behavioral analysis is a clinical term referring to the approach. Focus on entirely the observable behaviors and environmental manipulation to get change. As I said, reinforcement and stimulus control increase adaptive behavior. Punishment and extinction decrease maladaptive behavior. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to either control the environment in a way that it increases positive outcomes, or we want to shape a behavior through some form of negative outcome. And in doing so, by manipulating the environment or the response or the consequence, we can produce some really nice behavioral change. Now, we said reinforcement. Reinforcement by principle increases the likelihood of a behavior. And especially in applied behavioral analysis, it's important to understand schedules of reinforcement. So before I go into the concrete definition, I would like to define some terms. What does the word fixed mean? What does the word variable mean? What does the word ratio mean? What does the word interval mean? Fixed means something that is unchanging or stays the same. Variable means something that fluctuates. Ratio refers to number of behaviors, and interval refers to amount of time. So if you can conceptualize what those four words mean, the definitions I'm about to go through will make perfect sense. So a fixed interval reinforcement schedule suggests that reinforcement occurs at a set, stable, predictable, predetermined amount of time, as long as a behavior occurs at least once. So in operant conditioning, a behavior is governed by its consequences. So that means that a behavior still has to occur. But the amount of time that has to pass in order to get that reinforcement is predictable or set. Now, so let's say I wanted my child to do laundry. I could set a schedule of reinforcement or allowance at a weekly time interval. So as long as they do the laundry once that week, they would be eligible for that allowance at the end of that week. And it's predictable every 7 days. So that's fixed interval. The focus is on the time remaining relatively the same as long as the behavior is occurs. When we talk about fixed ratio, now the focus is on behavior, right? So it's the number of behaviors that must occur in order for reinforcement to happen. Now, time doesn't matter here. So instead of giving an allowance for doing the laundry once a week, we could actually ignore the weekly reinforcement schedule altogether and say, look, every 5 loads of laundry, I'm going to give you $10. Now, 5 loads of laundry, the focus is on the number of behaviors that must occur in order to get reinforcement. So if you do 5 loads of laundry in one day, bam, you got it. You got $10, right? I'm assuming that the family has a bunch of loads of laundry in this analogy, but you get the idea. So now the focus is on number of times you do a given behavior. It's stable, it's predictable, it's unchanging. So in the first example, fixed interval, that was a weekly allowance schedule. It doesn't change. Fixed ratio, I set it at 5 loads of laundry. That doesn't change. Every 5th load that's done, you get $10. Fine. Now, when we talked about variable means it's unchanged. It fluctuates, right? So when we apply it to interval, a variable interval reinforcement schedule is one where the amount of time that needs to pass in order to be eligible for reinforcement changes. So it's not as predictable, right? It's unstable, it fluctuates, but as long as a behavior is done, it will average to a certain amount of time. So remember that weekly schedule? Well, if we were to do reinforcement and we wanted to do the allowance, right, on a time frame, we could give you your allowance 7 days, 3 days, 9 days, 5 days, as long as at the end of, let's say, a year, it averages out to every week. So listen to what I'm about to say, because I'm not sure it's exactly on the slide. In a variable interval, the amount of time that needs to pass in order to get reinforcement will change, but it will come to a given average as long as the behavior is done. So that's what I mean. So as long as it averages out to once a week, so this time you waited 9 days, next time it might be 5 days, and so forth. And that's variable interval. It must come, but there are 2 points that I'm trying to highlight. It must come to a given average of time, and you still have to do the behavior at least once in that time period. And then variable ratio is exactly like variable interval, but instead of focusing on time, the behavior. So remember how I said in fixed ratio, every 5th load of laundry? In fixed ratio, it stays the same. But in variable ratio, it might be 5 loads of laundry this time, and then 9 loads of laundry the next time, and then 1 load of laundry the next time, as long as it averages out to every 5th load. So the same 2 principles are at play. In variable ratio, it still has to average out to a given number of loads of laundry. All right. So we also have something called backwards behavior modification, which is reinforcing undesirable behaviors and extinguishing desirable behaviors. That's not good, right? We don't want to do that, but we want to acknowledge that you could shape maladaptive behaviors to increase too. Now, we said that we use reinforcement to increase the likelihood of a behavior. We use punishment and aversive conditioning to decrease the likelihood of behavior. So aversive conditioning in general is whenever punishment is used in behavior modification. So with aversive conditioning, it tends to lead to a decrease or suppression of undesirable behaviors. However, there are many people who are critical of this approach because it doesn't fully eliminate the learned response. And in fact, you might see some avoidance learning where the person learns, hey, in this situation, I can't do that behavior, but in another situation, I can. So let's take an example of aversive conditioning. Let's say a child, and I'm not condoning this, I don't support corporal punishment based on the negative psychological outcomes, but let's say a parent used corporal punishment for their teenager. Their teenager stayed out beyond midnight, and the parents are waiting by the door, and they give the child a whipping, a spanking. It's true that that form of punishment is going to decrease the likelihood of a person staying out beyond curfew. However, what happens if the parents go away? Let's say they go away on a cruise, and now the kid is left alone at home, right? Now they're a teenager, so in this example, they might be at an age where they can be left alone. Do you think that they're going to keep to the curfew? Or are they going to use the saying, when the cat's away, the mice will play? The answer is yes. I don't believe they're going to keep to their curfew because there's not the opportunity to be caught, so they can do that breaking of the curfew if they want. So one issue is that you don't eliminate whatever the learned response is. And then other issues related to aversive condition is that it can create some really unpredictable or erratic behavior, and in some cases, trauma bonding. So use aversive conditioning as the last resort. Now, we talk about Pavlov, Watson, Maurer, and Volpe, who developed classical conditioning. You might hear it referred to as a respondent condition, but the principle is that if you pair 2 stimuli together, you're going to link through these stimuli a predictable learned response. That's the principle. So in classical conditioning, there is not necessarily a cognitive association that needs to take place. It could be physiological or physical link. So if you link the neutral stimulus, which eventually will be considered the conditioned stimulus, with the unconditioned stimulus, you will get similar responses to both the neutral stimulus as is the case with the unconditioned stimulus. So the classic example was Pavlov, right? So let's say Pavlov rang a bell, presented food, rang a bell, presented food. Well, if the dog has food hit their tongue, they're going to salivate, right? That's a normal reaction. That's biologically hardwired. You don't need to learn it because saliva is part of the digestive process. But eventually, just ringing the bell will result in salivating even to the same levels as food hitting the tongue. So we call that classical conditioning. Stimulus, stimulus, learning, pairing two stimuli together. So we can get a conditioned response or a learned response due to pairing two stimuli together. And that was the case in Watson's Little Albert study with the crowbars and the rat, crowbar and the rat. All right, but we get some other interesting issues, right? We have stimulus generalization, which is having a learned response to things that are similar to the conditioned stimulus. So an overextension of a fear response in Watson's case. Stimulus discrimination is the ability to discern between the conditioned stimulus and other stimuli. So now, if you can discern the difference between the two, you're not going to elicit fear. Extinction is the process of eventually stopping a previously learned conditioned response. Counter conditioning, we talked about as new associative learning, and spontaneous recovery is when a previously conditioned response resurfaces spontaneously or all of a sudden. Now, we talked about counter conditioning. Stimulus generalization and discrimination seem pretty straightforward, but I would like to do a deeper dive in extinction and spontaneous recovery. I'll get there though. All right. So maladaptive behavior in terms of a behavioral explanation for psychopathology is it's learned, right? So psychopathology occurs when either you learn something that is not adaptive, or it occurs when you don't learn something properly. So when we think of behaviorists trying to understand what's going on with maladaptive behavior and psychopathology, first thing you're going to want to do is observe and assess what behavior is occurring and what skills they have, right? Then you want to develop a hypothesis as to what was the origin of the cause of the maladaptive behavior and what keeps it going. If you can identify the origin of the cause of the maladaptive behavior and what keeps it going, then you could develop treatment for that issue. You could test your hypotheses and then eventually revise as needed. So doing behavioral therapy, you're notice that you're operating like a scientist. And in some cases, you're careful about what you introduce, you take notes on that, and you revise your hypothesis as needed. You also, when you're trying to help the person, serve as an educator, so you teach them. So the term psychoeducation is there. So you teach them about their symptoms, about what maintains the maladaptive behavior and so forth. So what is your job? Your job is to help unlearn old maladaptive behaviors and then learn new, more adaptive behaviors. All right. So as I said, though, now we see that thoughts and emotions and motivations are brought into modern behavioral therapy. So we talk about cognitive behavioral therapy, and they're used in conjunction. So we will learn about the different cognitive treatments, but we have our traditional cognitive therapies, right? Or cognitive behavioral therapies, which synthesize the two. And we're going to talk about Meichenbaum, and we're going to talk about Beck. But we also have other models to cognitive behavioral therapy, such as Albert Ellis, who has rational emotive behavioral therapy. And we have third wave cognitive behavioral therapy, which are newer therapies. Many times they profit from mindfulness techniques, such as dialectical behavioral therapy, which is a good example by Marsha Linehan, acceptance and commitment therapy, which is by Stephen Hayes, and EMDR, which is an eye movement technique that helps process trauma. So our assessment procedures, right? So the first thing you're going to do is do direct observation. That is the gold standard. You do not rely on indirect information. You want to observe what a person does in their natural environment to get a good picture as to patterns and whether the behaviors that are being reported are actually going on. And in a perfect world, behavioral therapists would observe clients in their natural habitat and take note as to what happened before, during, and after a given behavior, whether it be adaptive or maladaptive. Now, I ask people with panic attacks to use this process of writing a journal as to what was happening before they had the panic attack, what they did as to cope with the panic attack, how long it lasted, and what happened afterwards. So it's really logging, the experience. So, but that gives me a picture, because in an ideal world, I could observe you and see when it happened and take note, but we see you once a week more often than not. So it's hard to get a full picture, so we rely on your report. So we talked about functional behavioral analysis, or the behavioral ABCs, antecedent, everything that happened before behavior, what you did, consequence, what happened afterwards. So if a person had problems with aggression, so we would want to know, well, what triggered the aggression? What did they do? And what was the consequence of aggression? If there was no negative consequence, they're likely going to increase that aggressive behavior. If there was a negative consequence, it's possible that the aggressive behavior would decrease. So it's very focused, right? We also tend to use a behavioral interview as a form of assessment, right? So we want to try and understand, well, what brings that behavior on? So a question that you might ask is, tell me everything that happens during a day when you're depressed. Let's start with when you wake up in the morning and cover everything that happens until you go to bed at night. Then we'll talk about how you're sleeping. So notice we're still relying on our client's report to get a picture, but we're trying to help them string these series of events together so we can get a better picture. Or if a person has anxiety, we might say, describe your physical sensations you experience in your body when you're feeling anxious, right? And I take it a step further. I ask, well, what was going on? What happened before? And then, what did you do? And then how long did these anxiety feelings stay? So we teach people to self-monitor. It's a fairly straightforward approach because we can't be with you at all times. So it's very cheap, very practical, and it can increase awareness. Now, The problem is that you have to actually report the information that's happening. And one of the challenges I've experienced, and I know many therapists experience, is that sometimes people don't log their experience, or they filter their experience. They don't give enough information, or they show some resistance in sharing that information. So self-monitoring can be good, but we're as good as the information you provide us. All right. So in cognitive behavioral therapy, we keep thoughts or emotion logs. And at a minimum, we focus on your, three areas, which is your emotional states. We focus on disturbed emotional states like anger, sadness, resentment, the behavior that's engaged at the time of that emotional state, and then how your thoughts are linked to that. Now, this is just to get to a sense of awareness of the origin of the maladaptive thoughts and emotions, right? We're just trying to get there. Now, we will engage in cognitive reframing or cognitive restructuring as processes to move you beyond the maladaptive emotional state, but we need to get the information first, right? So we prefer trying to get this information. The challenge is that this is more subjective, but in an assessment, we try to get very clear, objective assessment techniques rather than some report of your thoughts and emotions that could be skewed. We have contingency management and token economies, which are processes of either reinforcing or punishment for a behavior. So Schumacher talks about this. When we talk about contingency management, token economies, we are going to either present points or stars or something of that nature that can eventually be converted into some reward. We do the points that you earn points for doing a positive behavior. Now, I think it's important to talk about there are different approaches to token economy. There are some token economies that only focus on administering points. So they're focusing on positive behaviors, and their process of extinguishing negative behaviors is to ignore it altogether. So there's no punishment involved, but there are other forms of a token economy where you can lose points, and if you self-correct, you could earn parts of the points you lost back. So I want you to understand, when you study token economies, there is not a singular model, right? So it could be strictly reinforcing or punishment and reinforcement together. Now, we want you to learn a behavior, and we want you to generalize that behavior across settings, which fading is the process of doing that. Now, in operant conditioning, we typically engage in what's called behavioral activation, which is to get you to do a behavior that is positive. And it used to be called activity scheduling. Now it still is activity scheduling. So let's say you had a person who was very depressed. And one of the things that you could see a person's depressed is because their daily hygiene could drop off. So many people are really depressed, might not shower on a daily basis. They might shower once a week. So you might say, okay, well, we're in therapy. Our baseline is that you shower once a week. I would like you to schedule 2 days this week where you're going to shower. And I would like you to tell me which days they're going to be. So Tuesday and Friday, great. Now you come into therapy the following Monday, I'll say, well, how did you do? Right? And you might say, okay, I showered on Tuesday and Friday. And I'm like, great job, positive reinforcement, verbal praise. But not only do I explore how you did, I start to explore how you feel when doing that. Because one of the behavioral techniques to address depression is to get people to engage in the behaviors they once did before they were depressed. So we explore how you felt as to try and get those positive emotions coming out and give you forward momentum. Now, what do you do if the person says, well, I honestly didn't shower all week? Okay, so now we have to say, all right, well, our goal was 2 times a week. Your baseline was 1. What do you think was different about this week that you showered less frequently than baseline? Oh, I was overwhelmed, this, that, or another. You can even use when they don't do the behavior as a process of exploration. Now, as I said, fading is a technique that helps you generalize learning from one setting to another. The way we do it is eventually we want to take you off of the reinforcement contingency. We want you to get to do it across the environment and for its own sake, right? So fading gets you to do that. So we transition away from the token economy by saying, okay, new rules. Instead of having to, I don't know, do your homework 3 times a week, now you have to do it 4. So you're shaping it, you're increasing the expectation. You also tend to decrease the contingency from 4 days a week to 5 days a week. And eventually you say, well, you've been doing your homework 5 days a week. How does it feel? And then we say, well, do you really need to have this contingency? So eventually we phase out the reinforcement altogether after it's been extended or generalized. Okay. Now, relaxation training. So when we talk about relaxation training, this is oftentimes really good for people who have anxiety, right? So progressive muscle relaxation is very early. It was based on a belief that muscle tension was a source of mental and emotional problems. We don't believe that muscle tension is a source of emotional problems. It might be a byproduct. So we still use progressive muscle relaxation as a way of helping people release tension in their body. So Gestalt therapists will use this, behavioral therapists will use this, people who are working with anxiety conditions will use this. So it is considered an evidence-based treatment. It does work as a form of counter conditioning, but there are other techniques you could use. Now, exposure techniques. So I want to get to some process to deal with fear and phobias. So we have this process called systematic desensitization, which is repeated and gradual exposure to whatever the feared issue is. What we find is that if we get repeatedly exposed to a feared issue, let's say spiders, we have a phobia of spiders, I could work you through a list of different exposures, starting with things that you would be least afraid of. We call this a fear hierarchy, and then most afraid of. And then we would slowly expose you according to your list, but we would teach you progressive muscle relaxation as a way of relaxing in vivo, in real time. And you would focus on your breath, focus on relaxation, and your body would self-regulate. Eventually, you wouldn't be afraid of whatever it was. Here's the deal, though. Turns out that progressive muscle relaxation may not be necessary as part of the process. We could do exposure to your fear hierarchy slowly, your body, because the sympathetic nervous system is activated, eventually the parasympathetic nervous system is going to modulate it. You may not need progressive muscle relaxation because the body's going to do the work naturally if you give it time. So how do we apply systematic desensitization? We can do it through a cognitive process through using mental imagery or imaginal exposure, where we ask the client to think about how they would react to the feared object. They don't have to leave the client's office, and you guide them through this process. In vivo is direct exposure, real exposure to the feared object. So eventually you would have to handle a spider in this concept, and then virtual reality exposure where you're handling it, but through artificial means, right? Through computers and whatnot. All of these tend to work. Now, intereceptive exposure, which is identical to the other techniques, except the target stimuli are internal physiological cues. So now, instead of focusing on the spider, the trigger, we focus on the byproduct of anxiety. So we can induce anxiety through hyperventilation, holding one's breath, breathing through a straw, shaking one's head, etc. There are 6 different ways you could do it. I'm not going to read them all. But what we do is we use breathing retraining, which teaches people to regulate their breath. And as they learn greater control over their breath, when they're actually exposed to that feared object, they can manage it through modulating their breath. So in terms of phobias, we reinforce the phobia by negative reinforcement. What does that mean? By removal of an undesirable stimulus, we increase that behavior. So if I'm afraid of clowns, by avoiding birthday parties, I reinforce that fear of clowns. That doesn't work. Eventually, we have to break that cycle, because otherwise that phobia is going to get stronger and stronger and stronger. So that we need to think about that as one issue. We also want to think of response prevention. So exposure and ritual prevention, or exposure and response prevention. This is used for phobias or obsessive compulsive related issues, where we trigger whatever your phobia or obsession is, and then we block you from doing your compulsion or block you from engaging in an avoidance response. Why does that work? So exposure and ritual prevention, or exposure and response prevention, why it works is because we have paired this behavior with a consequence. If we can uncouple it, we no longer have to avoid. So that's the beauty of that. All right. So modeling is another process. So social imitation, another form of learning that we need to talk about, if we think about it, is observational learning, right? So we talked about classical conditioning, which is a form of learning. We talked about operant conditioning, a form of learning. And observational learning is we can learn through the behaviors of others or modeling. So participant modeling or social imitation was useful. So one of the strategies of getting people to be less afraid of spiders is that if the therapist demonstrates that they can handle the spider without any fear, that's going to serve as a signal that, hey, the spider didn't harm the therapist, therefore the spider's not going to harm me. Now, you have to be careful. Again, this should be used like a spice. You don't want to use modeling all the time, but participant modeling requires it to be used strategically and with sensitivity. Now, we also have behavioral strategies, behavioral-based group therapy, that it has been demonstrated to be effective for anxiety disorders. For example, social phobia, group therapy, and participant modeling can be useful. All right, now let's talk about social skills training, things like assertiveness. Now, I want to distinguish between assertiveness and aggressiveness. Assertiveness is a way of advocating for oneself in a socially competent way, but doesn't cause any harm to other people. Whereas aggressiveness is a way where people try to dominate other people either through physical harm or coercion. We don't want to engage in aggression. So we are going to teach people social skills such as assertiveness, and that could include giving them clear direction, feedback, behavioral rehearsal, or role playing. I call it role playing, coaching, modeling, reinforcement, and relaxation. So people who are timid might not be as expressive as they need to be. So we use therapy as a laboratory experience where you can practice or tinker. So we role play this, and then we give you the example to try it in real life and come back and report how it happened, how it worked. So this model of treatment or assertiveness training became pretty popular in the 1970s. And it's based on an ideal that there is an ideal social behavioral style where a person can speak up appropriately, they can share their feelings, and they can advocate for themselves or their needs without dominating other people. We believe that this can happen through learning in therapy or training. Now, when we talk about social skills or assertiveness, there are two questions you have to ask. Do they have the foundational skill? Does that need to be taught? Right? If no, then you teach it. If yes, do they know how to appropriately apply it? And the assertiveness training is going to be very different for an individual who has the skill but doesn't know how to employ it versus someone who doesn't even know the basic skills. So there's going to be more of a psychoeducation or instruction when there is that clear deficit. All right, so now it's referred to as social skills training, and this is a component of many cognitive behavioral techniques such as dialectical behavioral therapy. All right, we also have problem-solving therapy, which is another cognitive-based behavioral technique. So this comes from Art Nezu, who's out in Drexel University, and one of his students and his wife. They came up with this model and they said, hey, this is how you address a problem, right? Depends on how you think about the problem and the solutions that come from it. Right? So they had two major components. So there's the problem orientation, which helps people to have positive attitudes towards problem solving. Instead of saying, I'm hopeless and helpless, why bother? It teaches people to have, okay, problem solving is a good strategy. And then teach people the steps for actual problem solving. So first you have to have a positive outlook towards problem solving, then you have to apply problem solving to whatever the issue is. So here are the problem solving therapy steps. You need to define the problem, identify the problem. You need to come up with a solution for the problem, right? Some kind of goal to address the problem You need to generate alternative ways to address the problem. And then you have to kind of set some parameters for how you're going to make decisions around the problem. And then you're going to apply these parameters to the suggestions you had, your default suggestion and your alternative suggestions. And then you're going to evaluate which rank order, which one is the best approach. Then you're going to employ the preferred solution and evaluate the outcome. If the outcome is desirable, keep on the preferred solution. If the preferred solution doesn't work or it's insufficient, you have alternative solutions there that you could go back into your bag of tools and apply another solution. And it's really, really powerful. This is something I use in therapy as well. So one of the primary foci of this model is learning and practicing problem-solving therapy skills. So if you do this, you can learn self-empowerment, and you could learn, hey, I don't need to be in therapy my whole life. I don't need my therapist to tell me what to do. I have tools for figuring out my own problems, and I'm going to be okay. Now, what I want to do here is share with you the video from Summers Flanagan. So let me pull that video up. I'm going to share that, and then I'm going to minimize my screen, and then we'll react to it and finish up the lecture.
This next session is an example of behavior therapy, and it features a colleague of ours from the University of Montana, a counselor named Selena Beaumont Hill, who's a member of the Crow tribe here in Montana. Now, behavior therapy is all about learning theory,
right?
Or learning theories is probably a better way to express it. But the focus is often on what are the rewards or the reinforcers that create and maintain behavior, and what are the consequences or the punishments that tend to diminish or reduce the rate of behavior.
And, you know, behavioral therapy is excellent for people in positions like Selena's to work with people who need to make significant changes in their behavior, and to make those rather quickly.
Now, Selena's working with Brittany. Brittany has flunked out of college. She's working on getting reinstated. And one thing I like about the beginning of the session is that Selena is working on just sort of casually discussing, maybe not casually, but discussing the natural incentives that are associated with Brittany wanting to be or staying in school.
Right. And some of the maladaptive behaviors that are probably playing a role in her having flunked out. So
absolutely. So let's watch.
Let's watch.
And I really just want you to describe some of the things, some of the patterns, some of the behaviors, some of the things you were doing that led to the suspension. So I'm just going to show you this questionnaire so you have an idea of what I'm doing.
Okay.
And this will be part of the reinstatement process if we do choose to go that route. And I guess I should get a feeling before we continue on. Do you want to be in school?
Yeah, I definitely want to be in school.
Okay.
I like school.
Okay.
Like, I don't want to not be in school.
Okay. What about school do you like? What keeps you here on the university campus?
Well, I have really good friends here. Like, I feel like I've made really good friends, and like, I don't want to have like a bad job. Like, I want to get like a degree so I can have a good job. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I think the town is pretty and the campus is pretty, and I mean, I'm pretty happy here.
And what do you think kept you from going to class as regularly as you did when you were in high school? What kept you attending your college classes on a regular basis?
Well, I think for one, I don't have like my mom like making me get up when I'm tired. And I don't know, I don't think I like love my classes, and because it's like an option to not go, like sometimes I'm just really tired, and it's hard too because like the schedule's so different. Because like with high school I had to be there 7:45 every morning, like it was always the same. But like now it's like Tuesday mornings I can like sleep in, but like Wednesday mornings and Monday mornings I have to get up early. And like I don't know, I think it's like really hard to like adjust to that because you don't have the same schedule all the time.
Okay. So you need a little more consistency. You feel like that might help you?
Yeah, I mean, because your body gets all whacked out when you're like sleeping late and then staying up late, but your body never knows what to expect, really. I think that's like part of the problem.
So I'm just going to show this questionnaire to you, and there's there's several options to choose from, and I want you just to pick a couple of those options as far as what you think contributed to your academic difficulties.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think those are the main ones.
Okay. So poor attendance, time management problems, and too much partying.
Yeah.
All three of those are very common for incoming freshmen, or freshmen, I should say.
Yeah.
It's the first time you're away from your parents, and
Right.
so that's just the independence that you are discovering and trying to find your own boundaries and all that's very common.
Right.
The too much partying is also another common experience for freshmen. The university can be fun. There's so much to do.
No, it's not like I'm like drinking all the time. I'm just like with my friends. Like, so sometimes I go out and I'm not even like have a drink, but it's just like hanging out with them, you know?
The social. I think the social aspect is what gets most teens or most freshmen. Sorry.
Yeah.
Just because you have, you don't have anybody saying you have to be home at midnight or you have to get up to go to school at it. Nobody's checking on you, and it's the first time you're just out being independent and making those decisions. So I can definitely see where that can come into play, which then affects the attendance because you're out late, even though you're not, maybe doing something that you're not supposed to be doing. You're just out late,
right?
Which that means you're not ready to go the next morning.
Right. Because it's not even like I'm hungover, It's just like I like can't get up when my alarm goes off. Like I physically, I'm just like so tired, which I don't mean to be, but
yeah. Just so that I can better help you, if you don't mind just describing a typical day for me, that way it just gives me insight into what maybe some of the other obstacles are. And so I have a worksheet here for a schedule, and let's just take, for example, Monday class day and what that typically looks like. So when's your first class on for this past semester? When was your first
9:40 is when I start class on Mondays.
And what class is that?
Religion of America.
Okay, and then do you have any other classes on Monday?
Yeah, then at, let's see, I think it's like 1:10. Yeah, 1:10 I have shamanism.
Okay, so a nice break in between.
Yeah.
All right, and then any other classes on Monday?
Not on Mondays.
Okay.
Yeah.
So your Religion of Americans, why did you decide to take that course?
It was just like one of the courses that was still available. Like I feel like I kind of had a late registration, and like I didn't really know what else to take, and I've heard really good things about that professor.
That specific course is actually an upper division course, and so that might be why some of you had some difficulty with that. Usually when you're taking a 300 or 400 level course, you want your writing skills. At least once your English composition course out of the way. There's a lot of variety.
I've noticed that like they're all like the older kids, and they kind of, I don't know, just like it's easier for them, I think. Yeah.
Also with upper divisions, there are sometimes prerequisites that there's no way in the system to prevent you from registering for a class with a prerequisite. And so that might be another problem, is they expected you to have a foundational knowledge before jumping into that one, and just skip that. And that's where I come in. I help with the academic advising, and that a little bit more later.
Okay.
The shamanism class. What was that? What class? How was that class for you?
It's interesting, but like I don't know, not exactly what I want to study.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it was like something that was free that fit in my schedule. But I don't know, like I don't love the professor, and I mean, I don't want to be a shaman,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, those are both kind of like religious studies courses, and that's not really my thing.
Okay.
So
I noticed Selena doing some nice focusing or psychoeducation on the nature of maladaptive behaviors. And that's really an important thing to focus
Right.
on when you're working with, I think, a young woman who's struggled in college.
Right. And I thought it was quite interesting to see her have Brittany talk about a typical day and kind of start identifying those contingencies and what was going wrong. It's also classic that Brittany was in an upperclassman class and a class on shamanism, and combined that with lack of good habits or maybe some bad habits.
Selena also, in the upcoming segment, works on contracting, which is another behavioral approach, as well as behavioral problem solving. In other words, how can Brittany use some skills to use new and different behaviors and new contingencies to change her behavior in a positive direction?
Let's watch how that works.
Okay, so as part of the reinstatement process, you have to agree to do some of these things. So it's really important that you understand all, because this is basically a contract that helps you, that keeps you on track for what you should be doing in the fall to help you be a successful student.
So I can for sure come back in the fall?
Actually, not for sure yet.
Okay.
What I'll do is go through this plan with you, and then after that, we'll call over to the dean's office, get you an appointment with them, and they actually do the reinstatement. They're the ones that decide.
Okay.
So remember in the beginning, I said it's important that you're really honest with me about everything.
Okay.
And the dean will ask the same, because what we want to do is make sure that you're ready to be back in school and that this is the right, first of all, the right university for you and the right time for you to be here. And
Yeah.
it's not about keeping you out of school, or not about not wanting to encourage you. It's just about making sure it's the right thing for you right now.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's not a, I guess it's not a form of punishment, but it's definitely a process to make sure that you're ready to be here.
Okay.
Do you have any other questions?
No.
Okay. So just going back to the questionnaire, this part of the reinstatement plan is attending class, making sure that you attend all classes for the semester, and just reflecting back on the questionnaire that you had filled out at the beginning of our meeting. That was one of the problems that you identified, was your poor attendance.
Yeah, it's probably the biggest problem.
Okay. And so and I know you talked about, the being social with your friends and staying out late. Was there anything else that kept you from going to class?
So yeah, just sleeping in, and I don't know, I guess like they don't take attendance all the time, and I didn't really think it was that big of a deal. Like, I mean, I don't always miss class, so I guess I didn't think it was that big of a deal. And I mean, sometimes it's boring and I'd rather do something else. Like when it's nice out, I don't want to go to that class where I'm like already not doing that well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Going to class is very important, and I know it's pretty easy not to do that. You've already talked about some of the obstacles that are the things that have prevented you from going to class. So I think this would be a great opportunity to brainstorm some possible solutions of you making sure that you make it to class, because we do, just in the different research, it shows students who attend class on a regular basis automatically do better than those who go occasionally. So and I want to come up with things that will work for you, not things that I think will work, but things that you can do.
Right.
So maybe just thinking back to high school and the times where you did have your parents' guidance on getting to school and the importance of that. What were some of the things that worked that you could now do here as a student, as a college student?
Well, I think like for me, if I get up the same time every day, it's easier.
Okay.
Like I said, I don't have to get up early on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and so it's really hard on Mondays and Wednesdays.
Okay.
So maybe if I like kind of got a pattern going so that it was easier, because it's just so hard.
Okay. And we can definitely try to build a schedule that meets that need.
Mhm.
What are maybe a couple other things that would help you make it to class regularly?
Well, not staying up as late would be helpful.
Okay.
It's just hard because I'm not really tired. Like I'll look at the clock and I'll see it's like 11:30 midnight, but I mean, it feels like it's like 8:30 or 9.
Okay.
So I don't know, maybe telling my roommate, because like she's often like the person that wants me to like go to the university center and get ice cream or like watch a movie with her. And like I'd like to, but it's kind of like sleepover every night.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So maybe I could just like tell her that I can't stay up late all the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So getting up at the same time each day, falling into that pattern, but also not staying up as late, which is also a sleep pattern. So it sounds like a lot of this is around getting rest.
Yeah.
And that is very important. So what are some things that you would do to make sure that you went to bed early? Nobody else is, I'm not going to be there in your dorm at 9 o'clock at night or 10 o'clock at night, reminding you, oh, remember our agreement. What are some things that you could do to monitor yourself and remind yourself that getting a good night's rest is important?
I could maybe like put an alarm in my cell phone at like 8:30, just like so I realize that it's like getting a little bit later, because it kind of sneaks up on me sometimes. It's so late. And like I've been taking a lot of naps. That's the other problem. So I'll like sleep in, and so I can't like go to class. I'm so tired. I'll get up and then I'll take like a nap like 3 or 4 in the afternoon, and then I can't go to bed early.
Okay.
So maybe like just if like I could even like not take a nap once, then maybe I'd get in the right pattern,
Okay.
you know?
So you've talked about patterns a lot. So that sounds like that's what helps you function, is finding a pattern, finding a daily schedule.
I guess that is kind of what it is.
Yeah. And that's human nature. I think we all work better if we kind of know what to expect and how to schedule up for ourselves.
Right.
I know for me, I have to have a to-do list each day at work, because I could be on email all day, but if I have a to-do list to follow, then that helps keep me organized for the day. So having your pattern, and what I'll also do is send you with one of these weekly schedules.
Okay.
And you'll also practice. This will be one of your assignments in the CNI Learning Strategies classes, that you'll map out your class schedule. Then you'll also map out when you'll eat, when you'll study, if you are part of any intramurals or student activities, any of that, you'll build that into there. But you'll also build in your sleep time in there.
Okay.
So you can visually see what your schedule looks like.
Yeah.
And even though, you might not follow it to a T every day or even every week, it's kind of a nice reminder of, oh yeah, I was going to try to, on Wednesday nights, I was going to try to make it to bed by 11 o'clock or whatever's necessary. So that sounds like a great list. Definitely, what I'll do is add that to the reinstatement plan, because I will give you a copy of this so you remember what we talked about and you have it to refer to.
Okay.
And the other thing that's important is that, you've come up with this list of strategies to make sure that you are making it to class on a regular basis. But it's also important that if you're able to achieve these, that you reward yourself. And sometimes it's something simple like going out for ice cream with your friend when she asks you to. Other times it's maybe something bigger, going out and buying yourself a pair of shoes or something.
Right.
What maybe are some possible rewards that you could give yourself if you were able to follow this pattern that we talked about?
Well, maybe like me and my friends could go like camping. We live like pretty close to some good areas for that, so maybe we could go camping.
Okay.
Like at the end of the semester.
That sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think that would be fun. And ice cream's always fun.
Yeah.
And shoes.
Yeah. So we relate on that.
Yeah, I totally get that. That sounds like fun, actually.
So camping with friends at the end of the semester, camping trip sounds like it would be very rewarding and kind of that ultimate what's keeping you motivated. On a daily basis, though, you also kind of need some of those little motivators. So maybe what's something that's a great overall goal to have, what's maybe something you could do to reward yourself?
Maybe, well, me and my roommate like to like marathon TV shows. So maybe we could like watch an episode on the days I go to class.
Nice. Yes, that's a great idea.
But not too late.
So build that into your weekly schedule.
Yeah.
Not after your bedtime.
Yeah.
Now I sound like a mom using the whole bedtime term.
Yeah, well, it's easier. Like I don't need bedtime if I'm tired. It's just I'm not getting tired at the right time.
Yeah.
So,
and that'll probably take you a while to get, because your body is now used to, kind of having these late nights, late mornings.
right.
And so to readjust to all of that will take you some time. So don't, I guess, don't be too hard on yourself. If tonight you practice trying to go to bed at 11 and you're not able to fall right asleep, it'll take you a while.
Right.
So definitely don't be too hard on yourself. Change is always gradual.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the overall consequences of maybe not following through with your plan. I think it's really helpful too if you look at maybe some little consequences that you can give yourself if you're unable to make it to class, if you miss a class.
Yeah.
One example you use for a reward is watching one of your TV shows with your roommate.
Right.
So maybe missing a class means you don't watch the TV show with your roommate. What are maybe some of those smaller consequences you can give yourself?
Like going to the library.
Ah.
Like maybe I would have to make myself go to the library for the amount of time that I'm supposed to be in class.
That is a great.
That would not be fun.
Going to the library.
Yeah.
Let's let maybe two more of those types of consequences.
So like not watching the episode of whatever TV show. And I don't know, maybe like scaling back on my weekend plans.
Okay.
Like taking one commitment out of the weekend that was something social I wanted to do.
Okay. And social class. Those sound like very good and reasonable consequences for missing class. And you've kind of given yourself a balance too. You have some positive rewards, then you have some consequences as well. And they're all doable, and they're all things that, that you can hold yourself accountable to and don't really need anybody reminding you.
Right.
Just to keep you on track with your plan of getting into a pattern in your schedule, one of the things I want you to do is a self-monitoring assignment. Nothing that's going to take a lot of time, just mainly keeping track of, when you're going to bed at night and things like that, so you can see what pattern you are in now.
Right.
And so, try going to bed. Try to find those times of night that will give you enough time to get a full night's rest.
Okay.
So let me give you this schedule. I'm going to give you this worksheet here, and you can just keep track of your bedtimes and what your schedule is like. And then you can also start, I'm going to give you a notepad, and you can also start logging down from here on out, when you're going to bed and whatnot. That way we have something visual to go back to when we meet again, to check on your progress, just to see if you've come up with your own pattern.
Yeah.
Or you'll be able to identify, I'm always going to bed at midnight and then I'm missing class that next day. So you can identify some of those, so you can identify that yourself.
Okay. So just keep track of like when I'm going to bed and then when I'm missing class.
Yeah.
But I can't miss any more class.
Yes. That would be the ultimate goal for sure. Do you have any questions about that?
I don't think so. I mean, do I have to bring it back to you?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Because that'll help me do some more brainstorming if need be for getting you back on track and finding that pattern that you've been talking about. So
yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and give you that worksheet.
Okay,
there.
and so I'll talk to the dean, and then will you let me know whether?
Actually, the dean tells you right then and there whether you're reinstated or not. So you'll know by the time you're done meeting with her.
All right.
So, John, that's a great case for a focus on rewards and contingencies, very clearly applicable to Brittany's situation.
Absolutely, yeah. And I liked Selena using the self-monitoring assignment toward the end of the video segment, probably because the research is really good that self-monitoring is a nice assessment from the behavioral perspective, but also it's an intervention in and of itself.
Right. And there's that little consequence of having to go talk to the dean. So I really think this is a great demonstration of behavioral therapy and how it can make a big difference for people like Brittany.
All right. So look, I think that that video was a good video. I will highlight some of the things that stood out to me. What they didn't describe, which is kind of a lost opportunity, is I think that understanding what the person was struggling with could help why they did the techniques they did. To me, as I was listening, I heard, well, gee, she has a hard time getting out of bed in the morning. She takes naps in the afternoon, and at night she can't sleep. One of the more common reasons why there's sleep disturbances is depression. And it's hard for her to mobilize. And I love the self-monitoring activity, but the question I would ask myself is she going to follow through with it? Now, she might be motivated to follow through with it because she wants to get reinstated in school, but there is the potential that her depression is so severe that even though she wants to self-monitor, even though she wants to log, even the logging is a burden for her. So I don't know how this case would end up. I do think that she did a great job trying to frame, well, take me through a typical day. That's a classic set of questions that behaviorists do to try and string, what's happening throughout the day and some potential environmental triggers and consequences. That's all good and dandy. That was a good thing. There was psychoeducation. There was teaching her about what's going on, and really you could hear her explaining how the process works. That was good psychoeducation. In terms of reinforcement for positive activity and some form of a mild punishment or contingency for negative or inaction, those were good too. My question is, again, whether she will keep to that plan. The best thing that I liked was the logging of, what time you're going to bed, because that doesn't require much in the self-monitoring process, right? Just, okay, I am going to bed, and it creates some conscious awareness for behavioral change. So there was a lot in the video. I think overall, look, I think the therapist did a good job, but there were some lost opportunities there too. All right. So if we were going to do a case analysis or treatment planning, we have assessment techniques. As with all the other ones, we have body sensation questionnaires, mobility inventories, agoraphobia cognitions questionnaire. These are all good at determining outcomes. Now, as I said, the behavioral and cognitive therapies, there's many different. And this slide says there's about 60 different treatment protocols. It's probably even more than that, according to what has transpired. There's always more interventions that are being developed. And then we talked about problem solving therapy. There's a great deal of research on it, that it is highly effective with children and adolescents, helping them deal with behavioral disorders. Now, behavioral therapy, what if I were going to ask you, well, Does it have cultural sensitivity? We focus, and I say we because I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist, but we focus largely on the problems and symptoms. Now, that means that we're not focused as much on the on the cultural background, better yet. However, I will tell you, me, as someone who's also interested in diversity, equity, inclusion, I do an interview to try and assess any cultural factors that are sources of strength or sources of distress, right? So CBT works well. It tends to be derived from, research on, middle-class Europeans or Westerners, but that doesn't mean that it can't be adapted in a multicultural context. In fact, there are some of us who have done that. Now, gender and sexuality, it doesn't specifically address women's issues. Now, obviously, when you think about it, you could apply one's behaviors, behavioral activation, assertiveness training when it comes, or empowerment when it comes to feminism, right? So there is some place for behavioral therapies there. And then, we see that it can work very well with LGB. It's interesting that it says LGB, separating the T out, but affirmative psychotherapy. When we talk about the LGBTQ community, it's not one community, right? So when we talk about the experience of transgender individuals, the struggles are somewhat different than lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals. So there might be a different model of treatment that we utilize. All right. So that's gender and sexuality. In terms of spirituality, behaviorists, while many behaviorists did not support religion as part of therapy, it doesn't mean you have to exclude religion and spirituality. In fact, I would argue that some faiths, such as Judaism, operate using Socratic reasoning, so the behavioral and the cognitive approach can be very helpful. And I ask this question: are you religious? And if so, are there religious or spiritual behaviors causing distress for you? And then, look, one of the nice things about this model is that it's very empirical and it's evidence-based practice. Not that the others aren't, but there's a great deal of scientific support for this. And with that, I'm going to stop and we'll continue next time. Take care, everybody. I wish you well.